For 16 years, Bob had been loyal. For 16 years, he had protected his family, stayed by their side, and loved them unconditionally. But when his muzzle turned gray, his legs weakened, and his once powerful body grew frail, they abandoned him, left him like an old piece of furniture no longer needed. Now, in a cold shelter, Bob had lost all hope. No one wanted an aging German shepherd. No one even looked at him. But then, one woman walked in, and everything changed. The shelter ghost. The Montana Haven Animal Shelter was no stranger to heartbreak. Every day, dogs came and went, some lucky enough to find new homes, others destined to spend their final days in a cold kennel. Bob had been here for 6 months. The first few weeks, he had waited by the gate, ears perking up whenever someone walked by, tail thumping weakly whenever he heard a voice that almost sounded familiar. But eventually, hope faded. Now, Bob didn't lift his head anymore. He had stopped caring. "Poor guy," whispered Emma, a young shelter volunteer, as she refilled Bob's water bowl. "He barely drinks anymore." Greg, the shelter owner, stood nearby, arms crossed, watching Bob with sad eyes. "We've tried everything." He stopped eating the moment he realized his family wasn't coming back for him. He sighed. "He's just waiting. And I don't know if he's waiting for a home or waiting to give up." Bob's ears flicked at the sound of their voices, but he didn't move. Until she walked in. A woman searching for something she had lost. Sarah Bennett hadn't planned to adopt a dog. She hadn't stepped foot in the shelter in over a year. The last time she had been here, she was with her husband, Jake. They used to volunteer together, spending weekends walking abandoned dogs. But then, Jake got sick. And in what felt like the blink of an eye, he was gone. Since then, Sarah had shut herself off from everything they once loved. The silence in her house felt suffocating, but she didn't know how to fill it. Until today. Something fate maybe had pulled her back to the shelter. She walked past rows of eager dogs, wagging tails and hopeful eyes, but nothing made her stop. Until she reached the farthest cage. A German shepherd lay curled up inside, motionless. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, didn't even lift his head. A chill ran through her. Something about the way he lay there, so still, so resigned, felt painfully familiar. It was the same look she had seen in the mirror after Jake passed away. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg and Emma exchanged a glance. "That's Bob," Greg said softly. "He's been here 6 months. He's old, Sarah. Really old." She took a step closer, kneeling by the cage. "How did he end up here?" Greg exhaled. "His family brought him in. Said he was too old. That they didn't have time for him anymore." His voice hardened with anger. 16 years, Sarah. 16 years he was theirs, and they just left him. Sarah's breath caught. 16 years. Her fingers curled around the cold metal bars. "Does he ever respond?" Emma shook her head. "Not really. He barely eats, doesn't react to people. It's like he's already given up." Sarah's heart clenched. She looked at Bob again. His cloudy brown eyes were empty. His once strong body was tired, worn down by age and heartbreak. She had seen that kind of grief before. She had lived it. Without thinking, she unlatched the cage door and stepped inside. A silent promise. "Bob," she whispered. "Nothing." She knelt, reaching out slowly. "Bob, look at me." For a long moment, the dog didn't move. Then, with a slight tremble, his head lifted just enough for his tired, broken eyes to meet hers. It was only a second, but it was enough. A lifetime of pain passed between them in that single look. Sarah didn't see just a dog. She saw a soul who had lost everything just like she had. She reached out a shaking hand and gently ran her fingers through his dull fur. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. And for the first time in 6 months, Bob didn't flinch. The beginning of home. The paperwork was filled out within an hour. The shelter staff watched in stunned silence as Bob walked beside Sarah without hesitation, as if some unspoken promise had passed between them. She brought him home that afternoon. The first few nights were hard. Bob wouldn't sleep inside. He curled up by the door, as if waiting to be abandoned again. He refused to eat unless Sarah sat with him. Trust takes time. But slowly, the dog who had given up began to heal. One morning, Sarah woke to find Bob sleeping at the foot of her bed, the first time he had let himself rest in a warm place in months. She didn't move. She just lay there, tears in her eyes, knowing what this meant. He was beginning to believe he was home. A love that never fades. Months passed. Bob's fur grew shinier. His legs, though still weak, carried him on gentle walks with Sarah. And one day, something miraculous happened. Sarah was sitting on the porch, sipping her coffee, when Bob slowly walked over and for the first time ever rested his head on her lap. Tears filled her eyes. She ran her fingers through his fur. "I love you too, buddy," she whispered. Bob let out a deep, content sigh. It didn't matter how much time they had left. What mattered was that, in the end, he wasn't alone. Because someone had finally chosen him. And sometimes, that's all any of us really need. The forgotten dog and the women who refused to give up on him. The Montana wind howled as Sarah pulled into her driveway, the cold biting through the darkness. In the back seat of her car lay Bob, a 16-year-old German shepherd who had spent the past 6 months in a shelter, abandoned by the only family he had ever known. He didn't move. He barely even breathed. Sarah sat still for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. What had she just done? Taking Bob had been an impulse, a decision made in a rush of emotion. But now, staring at the fragile dog curled up in her car, reality hit hard. Could she really do this? Could she save a dog who had already given up on being saved? She took a deep breath and stepped out, opening the back door carefully. "Come on, Bob," she said softly. The dog didn't move. Sarah crouched beside him, brushing her fingers against his coarse fur. "I know you're scared," she whispered. "But you're home now." Bob slowly lifted his head, his cloudy brown eyes meeting hers for the first time since they left the shelter. Something flickered there, a shadow of recognition, of something he had once known. A home. A silent battle. The first night was hard. Bob wouldn't enter the house. He stood at the door, staring out into the night like a ghost trapped between two worlds. Sarah didn't force him. Instead, she brought out a blanket, a bowl of water, and sat on the porch beside him. For hours, she stayed there in silence. She knew grief. She knew what it was like to feel lost in a world that no longer felt like home. Bob wasn't just an old dog, he was a reflection of her own pain. Sometime before dawn, as the cold seeped into Sarah's bones, Bob finally moved. He let out a long, shuddering breath, and, without a sound, lay down beside her, resting his head against her knee. Sarah's eyes burned. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. A life worth saving. Bob's recovery was slow. He barely ate. He refused to sleep inside, curling up near the back door instead. The first time Sarah tried to pet him, he flinched, not out of pain, but out of fear. What had been done to him? What had made him so afraid of love? Days turned into weeks, and Sarah refused to give up. She sat with him every morning, speaking to him in soft murmurs. She left his food near her, making sure he had to come closer each time to eat. She took slow, careful steps, never pushing too hard, always waiting. And then one morning, it happened. Sarah was making coffee when she heard a quiet thump. She turned and froze. Bob was inside. For the first time, he had stepped over the threshold on his own. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence, but he had chosen to enter. Sarah's heart clenched. She didn't move, afraid that one wrong step might send him back outside. But Bob didn't run. He simply walked to the corner of the room, curled up on the rug, and let out a long, weary sigh. He was trying. And that was enough. The first tail wag. Winter settled over Montana, turning the world outside into a quiet, frozen landscape. Inside, something was changing. Bob started following Sarah around the house, not close enough to touch, but close enough to watch. He ate more. His coat, once dull and brittle, began to regain some of its sheen. But it was the first tail wag that shattered Sarah completely. She had been cooking dinner when a piece of food slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Bob, who had been watching her from his usual spot, perked up. Then, to her astonishment, he wagged his tail. It was small, barely noticeable, but Sarah saw it, and she broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she dropped to her knees, reaching for him. "You're still in there," she whispered. Bob hesitated then. Slowly, he took a step toward her. She didn't push. She didn't force. She just let him come. And for the first time, Bob let himself be loved. The final gift. Months passed. Bob had become a different dog. He no longer flinched when Sarah touched him. He wagged his tail when she came home. He slept at the foot of her bed, just like he had with his old family before they abandoned him. But time was not kind to old dogs. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch, sipping her tea, Bob came to her side. He rested his head in her lap, something he had never done before. She ran her fingers through his fur, her chest tightening. "Tired, huh?" she murmured. Bob let out a slow breath. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. She had known this moment was coming. Love cannot stop time, but it can make every second matter. That night, Bob curled up beside her bed. He let out a final, contented sigh, and as Sarah whispered soft words of love, he drifted into a sleep he would never wake from. Not in pain, not alone, but home. The legacy of an unwanted dog. Bob's story didn't end with his last breath. Sarah made sure of that. She continued to volunteer at the shelter, but this time she looked for the ones who were overlooked, the old, the broken, the forgotten. Because every dog deserves a home. Every soul deserves a second chance. Bob had spent 6 months abandoned, but he had spent his final months knowing love. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The morning light crept through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow over the living room. Sarah blinked the sleep from her eyes, stretching as she sat up. The warmth of the crackling fire filled the room, but it wasn't what made her pause. Bob was watching her. Not just lying there, absent and lost in his own world. He was looking directly at her. For the first time since she had brought him home, his eyes weren't dull, weren't empty. There was something there, something lingering beneath the surface, like a memory trying to break free. Sarah's breath hitched. She sat up slowly, careful not to startle him. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, voice gentle. Bob's ears twitched. His head tilted slightly. It was such a small thing, but to Sarah, it felt like a breakthrough. She reached for the bowl of food she had left by his bed the night before. The broth had grown cold, the kibble soggy, untouched. "Come on, Bob," she coaxed, nudging the bowl closer. "Just a little bite." Bob didn't move. Her chest tightened. He had been starved of love, abandoned after 16 years of loyalty. How many nights had he waited for them to come back? Sarah sighed, setting the bowl aside. She would give him time. She stood and moved toward the kitchen, pouring herself a fresh cup of coffee. The aroma filled the space, warming the chill in her bones. She leaned against the counter, stealing another glance at Bob. And that's when she saw it. Bob's gaze had drifted again back to the photograph of Jake. The same picture he had stared at the night before, the one that had pulled a broken whimper from his chest. Sarah's grip on her mug tightened. Why? Bob had never met Jake. There was no way he could have known him. But something about that picture had triggered a reaction in him, a deep, aching recognition that Sarah couldn't explain. She set down her coffee and walked over to the fireplace, kneeling beside Bob's bed. "Do you remember someone like him?" she asked softly, following his gaze. Bob's tail gave the slightest twitch. Her breath caught. She reached for the picture frame, lifting it carefully off the wall. It was an old photo, one of her favorites. Jake stood by their cabin smiling, the mountains stretching endlessly behind him. His golden retriever, Max, was at his side. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Bob's ears flicked. His nose twitched. And then, as if the weight of time itself had settled onto his frail body, he sighed. A deep, knowing sigh. Sarah swallowed. You knew someone like him, didn't you? Bob blinked, slow and heavy. She ran a gentle hand down his back. 16 years was a long time. Had his owner, whoever had abandoned him, looked like Jake? Had Bob once had someone who smiled at him like that, loved him like that? Had he been waiting, all this time, for someone who would never return? A lump formed in her throat. "I'm sorry, Bob," she whispered. The first step toward home. Sarah spent the next few days doing what she always did, giving Bob space, but never leaving him alone. She sat with him in the mornings, sipping coffee as he lay by the fire. She spoke to him as she worked, her voice filling the silence of the house. And little by little, Bob started to change. One evening, after weeks of untouched food, Sarah heard something unbelievable. A soft click, click, click. Her heart pounded as she turned. Bob was standing, his frail legs trembling, his body weak, but he was moving. Slowly, painfully, he walked to his bowl. And for the first time since she had brought him home, he ate. Sarah's vision blurred. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just watched, her heart swelling with quiet hope. A dog who refused to be forgotten. Bob's strength returned, but the mystery of the photograph still lingered. One afternoon, Sarah decided to dig deeper. She called the shelter, asking if they had any records of Bob's previous life. Greg sighed on the other end of the line. Not much. Just the surrender paperwork. Who abandoned him? There was a pause. Sarah gripped the phone tighter. The name listed was Richard Lawson, Greg finally said. But get this, he's dead. Sarah's breath hitched. What? Yeah, died 5 years ago. Bob stayed with his wife for a while after that, but when she moved into assisted living, she gave him up. Sarah's hands were shaking. 5 years. Bob had lost his person 5 years ago. Just like Sarah. Her gaze flicked to the photo of Jake. Did Bob see something of Richard in him? Did he see a man who had once been his whole world? A man who had loved him as much as Jake had loved Max? Sarah swallowed hard. She didn't believe in fate. But maybe, just maybe, Bob had been waiting for her just as much as she had been waiting for him. A second chance at love. As the weeks passed, Bob settled into his new life. He no longer flinched when Sarah reached for him. He wagged his tail slow, but real. He followed her through the house, his old bones creaking, but his eyes brighter than they had been in years. Then one evening, something extraordinary happened. Sarah was sitting on the porch, the crisp Montana air filling her lungs. The sky was streaked with gold, fading into soft purple. Bob stepped outside. On his own. He sat beside her, his old body pressing lightly against her leg. Sarah held her breath. Then, so soft, she almost missed it, Bob let out a sound. A low, peaceful chuff. The same sound Max had made when he had sat at Jake's side years ago. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She reached down, resting her hand gently on Bob's back. "You're home?" she whispered. Bob sighed, pressing closer. And for the first time in years, he finally believed it. The truth about Bob, a forgotten past, a second chance. The woman standing in front of Sarah sighed, crossing her arms, clearly unimpressed with the conversation. "I don't see why any of this matters," she said coolly. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "It matters because he's not just another dog. He's not some broken thing you can toss aside." The woman's expression barely shifted. "We had him for 16 years. We gave him a good life." Sarah's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "And then you abandoned him." The woman didn't even flinch. It was time. Time. Sarah felt something cold settle inside her chest. Time for what? Time to throw away a dog who had spent his entire life loving them? She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Did he have another name before? Something you called him? The woman hesitated. "Bob," she said flatly. His name was Bob. Sarah swallowed, the name settling into her mind like a piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Bob. It suited him. What was he like before? She asked, her voice softer now, almost pleading. Did he have favorite places? Favorite things? The woman shrugged, as if she were recalling an old appliance rather than a living, breathing soul. He liked the lake. My husband used to take him there when he was younger. A lake. A flicker of something stirred in Sarah's chest. Bob had been lifeless since she brought him home except for that one moment when he had looked at Jake's picture. Why? Sarah turned back to the woman, her heart hammering. Your husband? What was his name? The woman frowned, clearly growing impatient. Richard, she said. Sarah's breath caught. Richard. She had seen that name before on Bob's old surrender paperwork at the shelter. But there was more. Greg had told her Richard Lawson had died 5 years ago. Bob's owner, his person was gone. And suddenly, it all made sense. The way Bob had been waiting. The way he had given up. The way he had looked at Jake's photo as if he knew him. Because, in some way, maybe he had. A dog who had lost everything. Sarah drove home in silence, her mind racing. Bob hadn't been abandoned by a careless family he had been left behind after losing the only person who ever mattered to him. And now he was waiting for something that would never come back. Her chest ached. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with deep oranges and purples, casting long shadows across the yard. Sarah stepped inside, expecting to see Bob curled in his usual spot by the fireplace. But he wasn't there. Panic shot through her as she scanned the room. Then she saw him. He was standing in the hallway, staring at Jake's picture again. Sarah's breath hitched. He was waiting for something, or someone. Carefully, she approached, kneeling beside him. I know now, she whispered. I know who you lost. Bob's ears flicked. She reached out, resting a gentle hand on his back. He's gone, Bob. Just like Jake. Bob's breath was slow, steady. Sarah's throat tightened. But you're not. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he sighed. A deep, weary, heartbreaking sigh. And then, for the first time, he leaned into her touch. The first step toward healing. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She grabbed Bob's leash. Sarah exhaled shakily. And now? The detective's gaze was sharp. Now we do. Bob's final mission. That night, Sarah sat with Bob by the fireplace, her heart still pounding from everything that had happened. She ran her fingers over his fur, grateful for him in a way she couldn't explain. You did it, buddy, she whispered. Even after all these years, you never gave up. Bob let out a deep breath. And for the first time, he wagged his tail strong and steady. Sarah swallowed hard, blinking back tears. They had given up on him, but he had never given up on them. And now, he was finally home. The dog who refused to give up. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Bob was standing. His legs trembled beneath him, his body frail and unsteady, but he was up. Not curled in his bed, not barely clinging to consciousness standing. Sarah blinked rapidly, as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing. Just weeks ago, he had been on the verge of death. She had spent every night afraid he wouldn't wake up, afraid she had made the wrong choice, afraid she was only prolonging his suffering. And yet, here he was. Bob turned his cloudy eyes toward her, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Then, slowly, deliberately, he took a step. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Come on, buddy, she whispered, barely able to speak. You can do it. Bob hesitated, his frail body swaying. Then another step. And another. Sarah let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hands. She had spent so long wondering if she had made the right decision, if keeping Bob alive had been for him or for herself. But as she watched him now, his slow, determined movements, she realized Bob had never been done fighting. The road to recovery. It wasn't easy. Every step he took was slow, unsteady. Some days were good. Others were crushing. But Sarah never gave up. She adjusted his therapy routine. She massaged his legs every night. She carried him up and down the porch steps when his strength failed him. And Bob? He kept trying. Day by day, The fragile, abandoned dog began to change. He started eating more. He wagged his tail when she spoke to him. He followed her around the house just like he had when he first started trusting her. But the real breakthrough came one quiet afternoon. Sarah was sitting on the couch, reading, when she felt a warmth press against her leg. She glanced down. Bob had rested his head on her lap. A lump formed in Sarah's throat. For weeks, he had allowed her to help him but never sought comfort himself. He'd been so guarded, so distant, that Sarah had begun to wonder if he would ever truly accept love again. But now he had chosen her. Tears burned her eyes as she stroked his head. "You're home, Bob," she whispered, "for as long as you want to stay." Bob sighed, his body relaxing against her. For the first time, he believed it. A life worth living. As winter deepened, Bob continued to grow stronger. He would never be young again. His body would always be slow, fragile, but he had something he hadn't had in a long time. A reason to wake up. Sarah took him for short walks, wrapped in a thick blanket to protect him from the cold. He had stopped flinching at every sound. He had stopped staring at the door, waiting for something or someone that would never come. Now, when he looked at Sarah, it wasn't with emptiness. It was with trust. One afternoon, Martha from the diner stopped by, her hands tucked into her coat. She smiled at Bob, watching as he carefully stepped outside onto the porch beside Sarah. "He looks like a whole new dog," she said softly. Sarah exhaled, brushing her fingers through his fur. "He's still Bob," she murmured. Martha nodded, then hesitated. "I never told you this," she said, "but when I first saw him at the shelter, I didn't think he would make it. Not because he was sick or old, but because he had given up." Sarah swallowed hard. "He did," she admitted. Martha tilted her head. "And what changed?" Sarah smiled. "I told him he didn't have to fight alone anymore." Bob turned his head toward her, his ears flicking slightly. Martha chuckled. "I think he knows." One last gift. Months passed, and with each one, Bob grew older. His legs became weaker again. His movements slowed. Sarah knew their time was running out. But Bob was at peace. He spent his days curled up by the fire, his nights resting beside Sarah's bed. And when the time came, when his body was too tired to fight anymore, Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't leave him alone. She held him close, whispering softly, telling him over and over, "You are love." Bob took his last breath with his head resting in her lap. Not in a shelter. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Home. The dog who changed everything. The loss was unbearable. The house was too quiet. The nights too long. But even through her grief, Sarah knew something for certain. Bob had changed her. Not just because she had saved him, but because he had saved her too. One evening, as she sat by the fireplace, a framed picture caught her eye. Bob, standing on the porch, his tail mid-wag. A reminder. A lesson. That love, real, unconditional love, doesn't fade with time. And sometimes, all someone needs is one person to believe in them. Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled. Bob's fight was over. But his story? His story would never end. The dog who refused to give up. Bob stood on his own. Sarah's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she watched. For weeks, she had waited, hoping, praying that this moment would come. And now, here it was, small, unsteady, but real. Bob's ears twitched, his frail body swaying. Then, with agonizing slowness, he took a step. Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth, her heart hammering. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Bob paused, his breath coming heavy, his muscles trembling. But his eyes, they were different now, alive. Not empty. Not waiting. For the first time in so long, Bob was moving forward, not just in body, but in spirit. A second chance at life. Days turned into weeks. Bob grew stronger, little by little. He would never be young again, never race through the fields like he once had. But he had time. Time to feel the sun on his back. Time to follow Sarah from room to room. Time to belong. One crisp afternoon, Sarah sat on the porch, watching Bob sniff the cool autumn breeze. "You should have been gone," she murmured, barely above a whisper. "But you're still here." Bob glanced at her, his cloudy eyes filled with something deep, something unspoken, something grateful. Sarah smiled, brushing her fingers through his fur. "You're not a shadow anymore," she said softly. "You're Bob now. And you're home." Bob let out a long, contented sigh and laid his head on her lap. For the first time in so long, he wasn't waiting to die. He was living. The legacy of love. Bob had been abandoned, left to fade away like he never mattered. But love, patience, and resilience gave him a second chance. No life is ever too old, too broken, or too forgotten to be saved. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share. Because hope is a story worth spreading.